I'll go ahead and bring up my screen right away. Okay, get in the right position here, make sure we're all doing good. The subject of Sivan 6 is something we probably all know about. And so I just, after a discussion 2 weeks ago about the question came up, well, how do you count 40 days if you're observing at Sivan 6? And I guess I should have gave a real simple answer. The real simple answer is, well, this year it's exactly the same because the people that keep it on Sivan 6, according to the calculated calendar, will be observing Pentecost, Shavuot, on this coming Sunday. So that's the easy answer, but I attempted to do the long answer 2 weeks ago. And so here's the long answer. That's kind of the purpose of this study is, well, why do we count 50 days to Pentecost from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath, whereas the Orthodox Jews, the rabbinic Jews, counted from the morrow after the first day of unleavened bread? So that's our first slide here. And I'll try to keep it pretty black and white, that's the background, and keep it fairly simple and to the point, hopefully. But one thing I wanted to point out was with Shavuot history. This is I just cut and pasted out of the this book here, Talmudic Development, and how the rabbis brought Sinai and Torah to the center of what had been a harvest celebration. In other words, if you listen to the rabbis talk, they talk about how this holiday, this holy day, celebrates the giving of the 10 Commandments. And they really don't get too much into anything about harvest. And so this is a short explanation. And what it's most likely, the earliest Talmudic statement on the date of the revelation on Mount Sinai may be found in Talmudic tractate of 86b. According to the calculation of the sages, the Jews left Egypt on Friday, the 15th of Nisan, which I don't think all calculated calendars would agree with that, but that's one opinion that they had, and that the Torah was given on Saturday, the 6th of Sivan, which is the equivalent of the 50th day of the Omer, the day on which the was permanently fixed in the scriptures. And this is according to the rabbis. Okay. The festival is transformed. In rabbinic times, a remarkable transformation of this festival took place based on the verse, in the 3rd month after the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day they came into the wilderness of Sinai, the festival of Shavuot became the anniversary of the giving of Torah. So this would be like in the 2nd century after 100 AD. They started to look at things this way after the Pharisees took control, 100% complete control of the rulership of Israel. And there's a whole story behind that also. So although Shavuot was known in the Bible by several names, including the Feast of the Harvest, the Festival of Weeks, as we would know it, and the Festival of the First Fruits, again, as we would know it, the sages added the name atzeret, which would be roughly equivalent to the word withdrawal. In other words, in the Torah, the last days of the two other pilgrimage festivals, Passover and Sukkot, are referred to as atzeret to indicate the seventh day of Passover, and on the eighth day after the beginning of Sukkot, that there would be no menial labor. So that was a way that they could describe it without saying Shabbat. But now Rabbi Jose, a second century sage, offers a dissenting view. He states that the Jews left Egypt on Thursday, the 15th of Nisan, and that the law was given on Saturday, the 7th of Sivan. Interestingly, the ecclesiastic calendar of the Book of Jubilees corroborates Rabbi Jose's date of giving the law. So we see at this period, between 1 and 200 AD, that they were just trying to haggle this out between them. Oh, what's the story? We got to come up with a story and stick with it. So my main point in showing this is to show that, well, this wasn't something that was really, BC times. They just started to come up with this in the AD times as they were developing the Talmud. And another Talmud author points out that the seventh day of Sivan was the equivalent of the 51st day of the Omer, one day after the fixed day of Shavuot. Consequently, Shavuot could not mark the anniversary of the law. So my main point here is this is something that we can see recorded arguments over. This isn't factual history. This is something they had to come up with a story, which they tended to be pretty good at coming up with extravagant stories. And so they all were agreeing that you calculate from the first day of unleavened bread. That wasn't the argument. They had to give the festival a different meanings, to go along with their other changes, you might say. Since they weren't involved with doing any of the temple service anymore, they had to make up a new meaning. So the rabbis did not have agreement about how to calculate Shavuot until they debated the options in later centuries and established an agreed date as recorded in the Talmud. We can read all their arguments with each other, all the different options, but now what they had to do was they got together, they did a vote, and out of the 70 in the Sanhedrin, whoever's story won the vote, well, that was the fact then. And you couldn't even go back and debate it out of scripture after that point because the rabbis voted on it. Although they do allow for differences of opinions, but the official day, the official meaning, was all set in the later centuries by the rabbis voting and recording it in the Talmud. So then the next step was to put the emphasis on the fact that Shavuot was a day of resting from normal labor, and then begin calling it a Shabbat. See, it was, well, we'll see, I'll show it never was called a Shabbat. The first day of unleavened bread was never called a Shabbat. The seventh day of unleavened bread was never called a Shabbat. And so I'm going to begin challenging everybody to follow along in your Bible and see if you can see it being called Shabbat anywhere in Leviticus 23 or in Deuteronomy or anywhere. And this is something we've just accepted as tradition, I guess. And so we call the first day of unleavened bread a Sabbath. But, you know, and with our English language, well, yeah, that works. But it was never called a Shabbat in the Hebrew. Shavuot, too, was given the name of Atzeret, you know, the withdrawal from labor, by the rabbis so as to emphasize the necessity of abstaining from menial labor on this holiday as well. In fact, for this reason, the sages referred to Shavuot by the name Atzeret almost exclusively. They refused to adopt the theme of giving of the Torah, though, and assigning a name to the festival, because in their thinking it would be sacrilegious to limit the celebration of the giving of the Torah to a single day. So they just said, well, we should, you know, rejoice about the giving of the Torah every day, because obviously they didn't have any agreement if the Torah, well, you know, they call it Torah. If we go back, I think they might be talking about the giving of the Ten Commandments. You know, because the Torah includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So that wasn't given on one day. So back to my point here. The Torah, I'll challenge anybody to, in our discussion time, to correct me. The Torah never calls Shavuot a Shabbat. Okay, this is in, I see I didn't put in Leviticus 23, but you will count 50 days to the day after the 7th Shabbat, and then you will offer Yahweh the new cereal offering. And you will bring bread from your homes to present with the gesture of offering, 2 loaves made with 2/10 of wheaten flour, baked with leaven. And these are first fruits for Yahweh. Now again, using this would be more of the Aramaic pronunciation as shown in the Assyrian cuneiform. The proper pronunciation in Hebrew is Yehovah, for anybody that's noticing. Okay, so in addition to the bread, you will offer 7 unblemished lambs, a year old, a young bull, 2 rams as a burnt offering to Yahweh with the cereal offering and a libation, and as food burnt. So we're seeing the command here, and if you go back, the Sabbath here in verse 16, if you look it up in your Strong's words, the Hebrew word, you'll see it's Sabbath is Shabbat. So you count 50 days to the day after the Shabbat, the 7th Shabbat. That's very clear. And it doesn't say week here in this time. It does in another place, which should be Shavuot, that's where we get the name of the festival in Hebrew. Is one of them is Shavuot. But here in Leviticus, it's you count 50 days after the 7th Shabbat. And you will also offer a goat as a sacrifice for sin, 2 lambs and a year old as a communion sacrifice. The priest will present them before Yahweh with the gesture of offering, in addition to the bread of the first fruits. These and the 2 lambs are holy things for Yahweh and will revert to the priest. On the same day, you will hold an assembly. For you, this will be a sacred assembly. You will do no heavy work. And you know, this is a perpetual ordinance. So we see that the day is called a sacred assembly in which you do no heavy work. So the actual day that we call Pentecost, the counting of the 50, is not called Shabbat. In fact, they're never named as being Shabbat. Here we have the first and the last day of unleavened bread, never being named as Shabbat either. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is a Passover of Yahweh. And the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread for Yahweh. And again, we have the sacred assembly and do no heavy work. And if anybody is finding the word Shabbat in there, let me know. And the seventh day, again, not a Shabbat. But the word Shabbat is used in these scriptures. For 7 days you will offer food burnt for Yahweh. On the seventh day there will be a sacred assembly. You will do no heavy work. Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, "Speak to the Israelites and say, when you enter the country which I am giving you and reap the harvest there, you will bring the priest the first sheaf of your harvest, and he will present it to Yahweh with the gesture of offering for you to be acceptable. The priest will make this offering on the day after the Shabbat, the Sabbath." And again, make a note if you look in your Strong's numbers, and just to confirm, but this is Shabbat. So we just saw that the first day of unleavened bread is not called Shabbat in the Torah. Okay, another point. The first day of unleavened bread was different from Shabbat in that it made an allowance for food preparation. You know, because it said in Leviticus 23 not to do any heavy labor, which is really, that word roughly is equivalent to, you know, doing your occupation. You know, so like if you're a cook and you cook for a restaurant 7 days a week, you might say, well, that's, you know, that's your occupation. Cooking is your occupation, which we're to abstain from our occupations, our occupational labor, not from all physical activities, or, you know, everybody makes their own choices as to how they observe this, but for 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you must clean the leaven out of your houses, for anyone who eats unleavened bread from the first to the seventh day must be outlawed from Israel. On the first day you must hold a sacred assembly, and on the seventh day a sacred assembly, and on those days no work may be done. You will prepare only what each requires to eat. So the point I'd like to make is, if you have a big group gathering, I mean, there's going to be someone working in the kitchen getting all the food ready, putting it out on the tables, just like you do if you're working in a restaurant. I mean, there's you can do your heavy cooking on the first day of unleavened bread and on the last day, because the point is, it's not a day where the resting is enjoined. This is a day where the assembling is enjoined. And so obviously there's a lot of work in setting things up, you know, the making preparations for everybody to meet, for feeding everybody, for taking down, for cleaning up. And so these days are not called Shabbat in Hebrew, and I'll emphasize that the Hebrew part of it, because your occupational work may not be done, except, you know, if you're a good cook and you want to keep the Nescos going just right, I mean, go at it. You know, warm things up, get your heavy preparation done on that first day to feed a lot of people, because we're commanded to assemble. And how this works is the Hebrew scriptures have a greater degree in defining the Sabbath observance, much more than the Greek. Leviticus 23, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, these are my fixed times, the fixed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as sacred occasions." The first one is the weekly Sabbath. On 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest. And so now, again, if you're following along with your Strong's numbers and Strong's words here, it's called Shabbat, Shabbaton. And here it's used that Shabbaton would be like an adjective defining the noun Shabbat. And the Hebrew word Shabbat, Shabbaton, implies a complete resting on the weekly Sabbaths and also on the Day of Atonement. Because the high holy days, except for atonement, are designated as days of abstaining from heavy work, but they are not called Shabbat. But rather, again, the allowances are made for large meetings, people to gather together, to be have an assembly, have, like we would do, have sermons, a lot of people getting together, not just your small little local fellowships like we do on the Sabbath, but a big gathering. So the allowances are made for a lot of, there is a distinction between Shabbat, Shabbaton, and just abstaining from your daily work. So when we see the word Shabbat in Leviticus 23, it is only the weekly Sabbath and the Day of Atonement, not the first day of unleavened bread. So the Lord, Jehovah, spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter into the land that I am giving you, and you reap its harvest, you shall bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest, and elevate that sheaf before Jehovah. And on the Morrow, the day after Shabbat, the weekly Sabbath." Now, when we go to the Greek language, there's less words for Sabbath in the Greek. The Greek word Sabbath is Sabbaton, because the Greeks don't have a SH. They only pronounced the S. So Shabbat is Sabbaton in Greek. And again, if you go to the New Testament and look up Sabbath in the Greek, you'll see that's in the Strong's Concordance also. And it's translated from both the Hebrew words Shabbat and Shabbaton. But more commonly, the Shabbaton, instead of saying Shabbat, Shabbat, they'll have Shabbaton as an adjective defining the noun Shabbat, even though Shabbaton is technically a noun also. But it's used as an adjective. Yeah, but there are a few places, and I won't go into all the details, but Shabbaton is either translated as Sabbath or as to rest. And so this would be the Greek definition here from the New Testament. And we see that Sabbaton refers to any week or, weekly rest, as well as the holy days. So you'll see in the New Testament that the first day of unleavened bread is called a Sabbath. So really, it's kind of ironic to me that the Pharisees, the rabbis, would use the Greek way of looking at things instead of the Hebrew. That's still a stumper to me, because they don't acknowledge the New Testament. Well, the New Testament says that the first day of unleavened bread is a Sabbath. The seventh day, Pentecost, they're all called Sabbaths because it's just any day, any way of resting at all. In the Greek, Sabbaton is used for any abstention from work. And as we know from Hebrews 6, Hebrews 4, that sabbatismos is used of keeping the Sabbath day. That's a Greek word for keeping, literally keeping the Sabbath day. So if you look at the different variations in the Greek usage of the word Sabbath, we see that it's very generalized, kind of like our English usages are also. So we'll go on here. Here we go back to the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint translation. 6 days shall you do works, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath, a rest. So here you see again that they don't use the word sabbaton. They use a different word in the Greek to, again, that you rest on the Sabbath. In Hebrew, it's Shabbaton. And in the Greek, it's Sabbaton is used for Shabbat. And there's different words used. In Greek, there's this. I think this would be anapasis, and then there's also katapasis. That would be how you do the act of resting. So there's different variations, but this would be in the Greek sabbaton anapasis, a holy convocation to the Lord. You shall not do any work. It is a sabbaton, but they call it, they take the word, and they change it around. So it is a little confusing if you're not quite as familiar with how the Greek translates from the Hebrew and then how that goes to the New Testament. So to make it easy, in the New Testament, any day you take off is a Shabbat or Sabbaton, a Sabbath. And a person can get a little mixed up, thinking that the first day of unleavened bread is a annual Sabbath day. Well, yeah, in the Greek and the Hebrew it is. The Greek and the English it is, sorry. In the Hebrew, it's not. But yet the Orthodox Jews say, yes, it is. It's a Shabbat. Kind of a puzzle to me. And I haven't seen any explanation as to why. So I'd like to open things up now to discussion. I hope I didn't get too overbearing with too many scriptures and too many words. It's just the idea, I guess, to summarize is that the original command is to keep the counting of the 7 weeks from the morrow after Shabbat, very clearly, the weekly Sabbath. And all of this juggling to make it, well, it's just weeks or it's an annual Sabbath or whatever. Well, I can see where a person would get muddled up if you don't look at the definitions clearly and don't look at the words clearly. But in Torah, it's clearly from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath. And somehow everything got mixed around, and that's what we have today, is people keeping the Pentecost on different ways of calculating. which isn't, not everybody knows all the Hebrew and whatever. And then they got their all different reasons depending upon what they've studied. But I guess I just wanted to make a few simple points in black and white and then throw it up to the group for questions.
Hey, Mike, it's Al Turner.
Yes.
How are you?
Awesome.
Yeah, I just want to say I don't worry about it. I just do whatever my pastor tells me to do.
Oh, very good.
Because that way I don't have to figure all that stuff out. If other people are already trained to do that.
Good sheep.
He said I'm a good sheep. I don't know if that's a compliment or not.
It can be if you take it that way.
I think maybe it gets muddled because the idea of resting, if we're to rest on the first day of unleavened bread, then it seems closely associated with the idea of Sabbath.
Yes. And
So
in the English, you can call it a Sabbath because we don't have a lot of different words defining the days.
But I would like to make the point that the preparation of food and all that, in Nehemiah chapter 8, where he's talking to them and they're explaining the holy day, he said, don't weep and mourn. Today is a holy day unto the Lord. Go and take portions to those who don't have any. And it's a day to eat the fat and drink the sweet. So, of course, they were preparing food on that day.
Yes.
And it was a day for celebration and for jubilation and to remember these markers that were given that are so important for us to reinforce our faith and to reveal year by year more depth of understanding.
Yes. It's a convocation day. Definitely it's prescribed as a convocation, and so it's going to be an active day.
So yeah, I liked your statement when you said, so each one must decide for themselves how they will manage the day.
Yes.
As far as what they will actively do.
Well, the rabbinic people, they kind of say the different things at the same time. So while the Orthodox view is that, there's not a specific definition of exactly what we can or cannot do on the Sabbath day in Torah, so we need an oral law and a tradition, so we know the 100 things that you're not supposed to do, like turning on a light switch or pulling apart toilet paper. But now, on the other hand, I was just listening to a couple of rabbis talk and saying how wonderful it is that we can, in Torah, we have the freedom to explore all different meanings. So in a sense, there are the 2 points of view in the Jewish community, that one kind of holds, well, we got to follow a list of every little thing we can or cannot do, and then the other side says, well, there's 70 different ways of looking at it because there's 70 different members of the Sanhedrin, and so not everybody follows the exact Talmud list within the Jewish community either. There's quite a bit of variation. Then, of course, the Karaite Jews, which Kara would be scripture. In other words, their name means scripture only. The scripture only Jews, they only accept the Torah and they do not accept the Talmud. And based upon that, they also calculate Shavuot from the weekly Sabbath, because that's exactly what the Torah says to do. No rabbis involved.
Well, a few years ago, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were touring through Michigan, and we went to Grand Rapids to see them, on display. At least, a portion of them were traveling. And they were describing the Essene community and how they had such great disagreement with the Pharisees and Sadducees that they wouldn't even so much as go to the bathroom on the Sabbath.
Right.
Some of the rules they made were so stringent and so restrictive that they really, really made a very difficult lifestyle for themselves.
Yes.
Thinking they were doing the right thing, of course, but nonetheless, in my estimation, going above and beyond what would be considered healthy.
Yes.
So you have every kind of opinion in the scope of human understanding, from one extreme to the other.
Well, there's one of the early church fathers who was a contemporary to the Apostle John and his disciples, Polycarp and Polycrates. And so it's very interesting to read what he says about it. And basically it looks like he's rejecting the Sabbath day entirely, but if you really look at the Greek, they don't follow all the strict rules of the Pharisees, is what he's saying. And then they say, as he said, as the apostles before and Yeshua and the prophets even, he knew that all of these extra do's and don'ts were added by the Pharisees. And so people will use his comments to show the Sabbath was done away, but if you actually read it carefully, it doesn't do away with the Sabbath. It's what he does is with the Judaizing. It calls it the Judaizing of the Sabbath. And that he followed the example of the apostles, which they were Sabbath keepers, as we know from their writings. And he wasn't a later one, he was a contemporary. He was the bishop of, which means the leader of the Antiochian congregation, Antioch, in Syria or Turkey now. But whereas the Apostle John was just over, not so far away in Ephesus, so he would have been a contemporary. And definitely, I mean, the early Christians were not anything like the Orthodox, what we call now the rabbinic. They it's more
they
like
were Corinthians.
Well,
they partied like a Corinthian.
They actually were pretty strict. I mean, if you read the writings, Corinth was a little, being rebuked by some of the other, if you see in the earlier writings, that they were a little loose. But yeah, if you read Ignatius and his writings to, the other people we know, Polycarp and that, I mean, they're definitely not keeping Sunday and Easter and Christmas. Put it that way.
Hey, let me ask you this, Mike, and then I'll let someone else chime in. In Romans 14, where he's going through this thing about doubtful disputations.
Yeah.
He introduces, I think in verse 1 or 2, not to be too concerned about things that are doubtful. And then when you go down the chapter, he's talking about eating meats and being a vegetarian, not forcing your own ideas on somebody concerning things that are doubtful.
Exactly.
And then, he talks about one man esteems one day above another day. Could it be that these were men who were keeping holy days on different days? And they were convinced in their own mind that they were on the right calendar? Because it says, let each one be convinced in his own mind if he's going to keep a day. But he never uses the term holy day, and he never uses the term Sabbath in that section.
Bringing up the Dead Sea Scrolls, which there's a lot more knowledge out, but the Essenes actually used a different calendar than they didn't use a lunar calendar, but a lot of them believed in Messiah.
Uh-huh.
And so there were debates about that. So what we call it is the Enochian calendar now. And I'm not saying all Essenes, but there was a good portion of them that followed the Enochian calendar. And the Jewish temple in Egypt followed the Enochian calendar. So, I mean, you might see that going around on Facebook, people trying to convince people. I don't think the other thing is the Samaritans kept a different way of calculating the first day of the month. The Samaritans, again, they were baptized because they were of Israelite blood, before Cornelius was the first Gentile. And the Samaritans believed you kept the first day of the month according to the conjunction, while the Jews believed it at the time, it was kept according to the first sighting of the first crescent. So there probably were calendar wars. I know there was at least 3 different ways of calculating the calendar at that time, and there were groups that followed Messiah, and so it could have been, like you say, it doesn't lay it out here, but
because it's always been a mystery to me. What is Romans 14 getting at? Let each man be convinced and be satisfied with his own decision on keeping a day to the Lord. It doesn't say kind of day, so it's a little bit obscure in that way.
Yes, but I think they had calendar wars at that time, especially between the Pharisees and the Sadducees about how to calculate Pentecost. So there might have been that within the church too, where a person of a Pharisaic background would be saying, "Oh no, we got to do it on Sivan 6, just like we have today." So yeah, it's interesting. There probably were some groups going off different ways, and then the question.
Well, maybe that's what that Colossians 2:16 is getting at then. Let no man therefore judge you in keeping, in food and in drink and in keeping of an holy day or Sabbath. It wasn't that he's saying don't observe, but he's saying because there's differences in understanding within the body, don't be ripping into each other with harsh criticism.
I do believe that's the correct, myself. I believe what you're saying is right. And that people can be pretty bullheaded about what they believe, and that their way is the one and only way, and everybody else is wrong. And don't be arguing with that person. Try to find common ground as brothers. Mm-hmm. I don't think it meant that the holy days were done away. I think that there is just how do you deal with variations on the theme.
All right, I've overstayed my statement. Go ahead, whoever else wants to.
David, looks like you're trying to figure out how to unmute, huh? Down in the lower left corner, there's a bar, and you drag it across. There we go.
Yeah, it's good study in all seriousness, but I was just shocked that all these Jews, they just don't agree on everything.
They're as bad as us.
As bad as us.
Yeah.
I didn't think we had that much trouble.
Oh no,
it takes them a couple hundred years. We can get by just a few.
Oh, I think we probably do have a greater rate of. They can be more stable, probably.
Yeah, a little less hard-headed, maybe. Maybe not. I don't know.
And then we're gonna put some cinnamon.
People think Judaism is a monolithic thing, that they're all the same, and oh no, they got. I mean, if you got 3 rabbis in a room, you have 4 opinions at least.
I was just going to say that. I heard that same thing this last week. I'm like, yeah, that figures.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's good study.
Oh, thank
Good to
you.
hear from you.
Likewise. Yeah, good to see you guys.
We were trying to keep it down. We got a household.
Oh,
Peter
yeah.
and the kids are here.
Yeah.
So we
Awesome.
are together and we're all listening. We got you live on speaker, so everybody got to hear.
Oh, hi to everybody. Super. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, that's all I got for now.
Okay. Yeah, I might be preaching to the choir here because, but I thought it would be good to know, with just a few scriptures, why other people are different, or why we're the way we are, as it's a season, about, and this year, Sivan 6 is on the very same day as, as May 20th. So they'll be keeping Shavout on Sunday.
Actually, I was curious about it, and I did look it up. But in the book of Lamentations, at the very beginning, it talks about a time when the feasts will be, well, let's just say, not done away, but they won't be kept because there won't be any means to keep them during the tribulation, which is what it's about. So I was looking to see in there if it said anything about the Sabbaths.
Oh.
It didn't. It actually says, let's see, no one comes to the set feasts, and all her gates are desolate. So they don't come to the appointed times. It doesn't say Sabbaths.
Well, I'll make a quick point here. There's something I'm oh.
Even so you can see it.
Hey. Oh, wow. Yes. Young man.
Yes,
Awesome.
he's getting to be quite the young man.
Oh, my. Yeah. But, in the years ago.
Come on, Friday. He's the milkman. He's Mr. Mike.
Uh-oh, everybody's coming out to see you.
Everyone knows him.
Milkman.
I'm kidding.
Oh, wow. Hi. Awesome.
I remember you.
Yes, and I remember you, but you are really growing. Young ladies.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. Yeah. Do you know, church day was an awfully busy day back in the day. And everybody got up early in the morning and had to work hard to get everybody all together. And
the screen is saying everything you say.
Yeah.
All
Yes.
right.
That's because he's speaking.
And then after that, there was basketball or spokesman's club, and everybody spent the next day recovering from the rest day.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And we saw very clearly, it says the weekly Sabbath is a day of complete rest. And so now that we've been kicked out of the synagogues, you might say,
Yeah.
we can feel okay to stay home in a small group, rest, fellowship, and have a relaxing day, which I think is so wonderful.
Yes.
It took a while for me to understand that, but when you look at it, it's just like atonement, except that you can eat on the weekly Sabbath, but take a day off. I mean, rest.
Right.
Don't come out of the weekly Sabbath all frazzled.
Right. Yeah, I do enjoy it. We have a Bible study here. Generally, there's not really a group very close to us, so it's not real convenient. And especially summertime, where we are, everybody flees this town because they're all transient. They're coming and going, and usually Sabbath mornings they're going.
Yeah.
So it's hard to get out of town on a Saturday morning
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
So we still meet home. Well, what?
Did you tell him about the singing thing?
What thing?
The group battalion? That thing?
Mm-mm.
Really?
If you got something to tell them, you can tell them. You're right here.
Can we say a
Don't
prayer?
be shy. The guys, Sophia and James, are playing an instrument this year at school.
Trombone. I'm playing a trombone.
Awesome.
Yeah, they
I
had.
can play Amazing Grace.
Yes.
We put them on for special music once in a while.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yes.
So Sophia plays the clarinet, and
Oh,
they're
wow.
doing really well. It's really just a pleasure to see them growing. And James is getting so he knows his notes, and now he's starting to learn to get more fluid with it. So it's not so, what's the word for it? Just broken up.
It's subconscious, embedded in the subconscious mind. Yeah.
Yeah, he's just gotta practice more. I told him he's getting the notes now. He's got to practice. But it's
Yeah.
pretty cool. First time he picked it up, didn't you play the theme to Star Wars or something? It was like without even being trained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Talent.
I don't mean to steal your Bible study, so
Oh,
Anyway.
it's just great to see you guys. Thanks for joining in. And yeah,
yeah.
sometimes people don't have too many questions, so it's good to have, good to see you.
Yeah, I'm gonna make it into 2 balls.
Well, it's good to see you.
So if you're gonna be done, get your hands out and wash them off.
All right.
Finish this, okay?
What the?
Yeah, shoot across the back.
Yeah, that's if they turn their camera on, you could see all these people. James is looking at all the names up there, wondering why they're hiding.
Yes. Of
There we
course.
go. There's it.
There's another person.
It's good to hear you this time, Alan.
Whoa.
That's Turner, Jeffrey Hagan,
Do we know
Donald
these
Wales.
people?
I know them. I don't know if you've met them or not.
Hello.
Donald Wales is hiding behind that label.
Yes.
Is he doing the FBI thing? Oh, he's gone. He vanished. Or
Yeah,
something.
don't knock.
Nobody home.
Camera's too high.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, he knows exactly what he's doing.
There we go.
Yeah, there he is.
okay, stand up.
Hey, Mike.
This is James. He's my grandson.
Easy low.
For those of you that didn't
Yeah.
have it.
Okay. Well, Jeff has a question, so we'll.
Okay.
In your original starting point, when you were going through what the Sanhedrin was deciding and the rabbis,
Yes.
you always wondered where the Catholic Church got the fact that they thought the Pope could make rules and they superseded the Bible.
Right.
They got it from the Jews.
Exactly. The Jews started doing that right after about 100 AD with Rabbi Akiva and Yochanan, and they got together and they decided, well, it's you got 70 smart people, and the truth will come out if you got that number 70. So they figured whatever they come up with, that's the highest wisdom. And,
Hey, Mike, I have another question concerning the count. We are only told on the one occasion to count to 50, as if no date could be given on the when it would be, which is obvious. It falls on different days.
yes.
But why wasn't it assigned a date rather than a count?
There you go. That's the perfect question to ask a Sivan 6 observer, because every other one is assigned a date. The 15th day of the month, they could have said the 6th day of the month.
But I'm asking you, what do you think that in your own surmising, what reason would there be that this one holy day is a count?
Oh,
I don't know. I
Right.
don't know. It's just the only time it's delivered that way. It's the only time that we're asked to do that. I thought maybe it's so that we anticipate as you count down to something, you get closer and closer, and there's a kind of a building of an excitement. But I don't really know why we have to count.
well, see, back in the day when it was a harvest festival, it was their way of tithing. In other words, they counted their omer so they could take 1 out of 10 to the Levite, take it up. So you might say that festival was the delivering of the first tithe of the grain harvest to Jerusalem. I mean, it was a fiscal day, kind of like April 15th here. And so it was all about tithing, from the land. And so now that we don't have a temple, we have to come up with a spiritual meaning, which is what the rabbis did. Well, we don't have a temple now. Well, what can we celebrate? Since we're not counting our omers, as we're living in a scattered, a situation here. And so they had to find other meanings. But now, if you would ask my gut feeling, my opinion, I think if you look at the New Testament, it's very obvious that our Messiah was rising at the beginning of the first day of the week. And if you look at the Greek between the Septuagint and also the New Testament, there it makes a thing about the first day of the week and using the same words. And so I am thinking it's one of the things looking forward to an exact literal fulfillment by Messiah, that the resurrection occurred directly in line with the morrow after the Sabbath. So when the Sabbath was done, he arose. He had his 3 days and his 3 nights in the tomb, and he arose as we think of midnight as the beginning of the day, but the beginning of the day in Israel and Greece and all the Middle Eastern nations was at sunset. So the beginning, the dawning of the first day of the week, which in the Greek it's the word is protos, the first. The dawning of the first day of the week was what we would call Saturday evening. And so I believe that's another sign of the Messiah, is that his resurrection occurred exactly, on the exact time. So looking backwards, you can, hindsight, you can see it 2020. You couldn't have predicted it necessarily, but looking in hindsight, well, that's the exact day Jesus, Yeshua, rose from the dead. Was on the morrow after this.
At the completion of the Sabbath.
As the first day of the week was dawning as it was getting dark, at sunset and getting dark.
Do you think there's any possibility that the count to 50 could be the count to the first resurrection?
Well, the first resurrection was Yeshua, Jesus, he was the first resurrection.
Well, you know what I mean, though, the church.
Yeah. just defining it there. But that is a very good possibility. I mean, you can see a lot of parallels with the offering up of the first fruits correlating to the resurrection of the saints, so there's a lot of people that believe that it's a one-to-one deal, that the actual resurrection could be on the exact day of Pentecost in the year that it occurs. So I believe it was 2007. We were calculating it out that if you take 1,335 days from the Feast of Trumpets in 2007, I think that was the year, it came out exactly to Pentecost 3.5 years later. So, yeah, there definitely there you can draw a lot of parallels. I don't know if you can make a dogmatic statement, but a lot of people think that. A lot of people have done the math and come up with that idea.
Of course, the problem would be, how do you fit in at the last trump? And is there a trump at Pentecost?
That would be the last trump, but not the. See, now again, people don't do their math. If you take the series of events from the last trump, the seventh trumpet, you have seven more bowls of wrath poured out, which take time. I mean, it's not just poof, poof, poof all in an hour. These things, I mean, one's poured out and it sinks in, it takes its effect. The other one is poured out. And so you have an undetermined amount of time for those seven bowls of wrath to be poured out upon mankind. So there is that idea that the wedding supper occurs during those last seven bowls of wrath being poured out upon all those who are blaspheming. That would be the actual, the greatest day of wrath is the pouring out of the bowls of wrath, the day of the wrath.
Which is June, that would be June, July, and August by our reckoning.
Yeah, so, yeah,
talking
yeah.
about the summer season being the season of the wedding.
Yeah, and that the actual, returning to Earth for Armageddon isn't on the exact same day as the
Resurrection.
as a resurrection of the last trump.
What's going on, Tom?
Some milk.
So I think that's again, if you're doing your math, you'll start to come up with that. And most people, I didn't for years. I didn't, I thought, the last Trump, poof, then the next thing you know, the armies are returning and battling the armies of the world. But I mean, if you look at it, there's a whole time progression for the armies to gather. They're camped out at the dried up Euphrates, and they need to move on over to Megiddo. And I mean, and then they got all these demons being released, and all of these bowls of wrath being poured out. And I mean, it's a whole deal.
So you think that maybe the first resurrection is the place of safety?
No, no, but I mean, it's the seven trumpets are not, the seventh trump isn't the last event. There's seven more bowls of wrath being poured out.
Right. But if Pentecost was the seventh or the last trump for the resurrection, then people who are resurrected, whether they are alive or dead at that time, are in a safe place.
They're up in the sky, yes. And again, our background is that, well, everybody has to stay on the earth, but it plainly says they rise up, into the heavens. And then it talks about the angels going in and out of the temple, and the door of the temple being closed. I mean, there's a whole lot of events between the last trump and Armageddon.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so
it's like historically we've kind of ignored the summer season as a season filled with events,
Well, in the Jewish culture, they have their 10th of Av, the 9th of Av, and the 10th of Av, which are their fast days, because that's all the bad things happen to them on those days. So that's a summer date, the summer, day of, it's not a good time, put it that way.
But they're fasting because of things in the past.
Right.
The churches of God have never really looked at the summer season as though it had great significance in prophetic history.
Well, it's just the harvest of all the rest of the harvest. See, the spring harvest is very specific. It's grain. But then you have, all of the grapes and the vegetables and the different fruits, the figs, whatever. So, I mean, they were working all summer. The grapes started actually right after the grain was done.
But didn't the churches of God typically assign all those summer fruits to the fall harvest?
Well, that's where the fall harvest is where you celebrate the hard work you did all summer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because then you had the fall festival was kind of a big county fair. It was a nationwide fair, you might say. And everybody brought in their tithes of all of everything, the tithe of the wine and tithe of this or that they harvested in the summer. Well, the olives aren't, they go, harvest goes into December. So you could maybe bring the first fruits of your olive harvest, but, olive harvest goes into December. So not all the crops were done by the feast.
So maybe they would bring the oil from last year's olives, you know.
Yes. But not for the first fruits offering. But they could bring, bring their pickled olives from the year before for feasting, but they still, the idea of the first fruits was they brought in their first of their barley.
Yeah.
And then you count 50 days. Well, that finished the grain harvest, so they were finished with the grain harvest, at least that they could bring in 1/10. Like if they weren't all done, they could bring in their tithe,
Yeah.
their first fruit offering. And so it was all around the harvest back, way back when. And it was a time of, for taxes. They brought you might say, their taxes in on those dates. And then the fall feast was, well, then you save a part of your grape harvest, to bring up as your tithe. And maybe you brought a new wine, maybe you brought fresh grapes, depending on what kind of grapes you had. But the feasts where it says, three Hak festivals, the Moedim, were the time that you bring up your offerings, and so really it was they were financial, whereas nowadays we look at it from its spiritual significance, but as a nation it was their taxation system. Then it was a big party at the end of the harvest too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing to look at. Looking at the timing is if it starts before the grapes are harvested, how do you don't want to have the Feast of Tabernacles right in the middle of the grape harvest. So that's why it's usually in October.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine there's some crops still in the field when you go, but
Oh yeah, there are. There's the olives are really very significant because you usually could only bring your first fruits of olives by the fall feast, and then they still are, they're harvesting olives, but there's olives that go all the way to December.
mm-hmm. So what do the 2 wave loaves represent?
That's another good question. That would be a whole nother Bible study. But if anybody has any ideas, take right over.
They gotta have leaven in them.
Well, I mean, I've heard a lot of different explanations, and they all make sense. So
there's something in the chat room if you want to look at it.
Thanks, Mike.
yeah.
I have an idea, a thought.
Okay.
It says you got 2 loaves, one you lift first, and then you lift the other right after. So as the dead in Christ rise first, and then those of us who are alive and remain.
That is a very good explanation, possibly.
Possibly.
But I mean, no, that's why we aren't given all these things. What the rabbis were saying when I was listening the other day is the reason all the details aren't given in the Torah is so that when we do our Torah reading, we can sit and talk about that. If it was all laid out, there's no discussion. But if there's many possibilities, and everybody looks at it from a little different point of view, so it's a good way to draw out discussion. And so my opinion is that it wasn't all laid out point by point so that we could have discussion on the Sabbath days.
Amen. Good to have discussion.
It's all black and white, no discussion.
Right. I didn't mean to steal the show. I was just saying.
No. Anybody else has any ideas? Just pop up, and then as soon as we're done with the subject, then we can go to just everybody saying hi and chatting. Yeah. The good old days at the Boucher residence on Sabbaths. I miss them.
Well, if we don't have any other discussion, I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay. And